Relevant ba ang economics? Oo naman! From adulting up to your favorite series, may economics dyan! Let's talk about them here on ECONvo, Economic Conversations. ECONvo is powered by the Foundation for Economic Freedom and sponsored by Atlas Network.
Wow! Keep quiet, mga person. Let's start our class, mga person. For the lessons, alright? For the economics, and for the Adam Smith. Did you know who's Adam Smith, mga person? Wow! What? You don't know for the who is Adam Smith? Ay naku, you should study Adam Smith, mga person. Adam Smith is an important person in our topic.
So I first encountered Adam Smith during college, but as far as I remember, it wasn't that comprehensive. In fact, whenever I talk to my friends about development and other nerd stuff, they always use Adam Smith as the butt of a joke. They always say that, oh, we must have invented capitalism and its problems. He promoted selfishness as virtue and endless consumerism and such and such. And now look at our world. Then they compare him with Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism. More on this later, but my point is Adam Smith remains fascinating and controversial figure, right? And it would be awesome to talk about him today. Now we've invited Dr. Brian Chang from the Adam Smith Center for this very reason. Dr. Brian, can you briefly introduce yourself and explain to us your mission at the Adam Smith Center?
Sure, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be featured on your podcast. So, I'm the founder of Adam Smith Center. Yes, it's Singapore's first and only pro-market organization. Personally, I'm also a researcher in economic development. So, the intellectual contributions of Adam Smith and various topics within political economy are things that I research into. So, one of my missions, at least with regards to the Adam Smith Center, is really to promote economics education to help young people, really, and the public at large to better appreciate the ideas of people like Adam Smith and the importance of economic freedom, markets, the rule of law, and political freedom. So I'm happy to be featured. Thank you very much.
Now, Dr. Brian, my first question to you is who was Adam Smith? Can you give us a short introduction about his life?
Sure. So, first of all, Adam Smith was a Scottish philosopher and economist, born in 1723, where there were changes in the intellectual environment towards, greater reason, towards greater freedom and greater openness in society and the economy. So, Adam Smith is very well known for writing the book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, which promoted a new view of economics and society. But he also promoted a more nuanced view of human nature than many of his critics portrayed him to be presenting. Because he also wrote this other book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments as well, which kind of focused on the way human beings had a moral judgment and sympathy towards others, right? And how this was also important for the well-functioning of society. So it was not just about people consuming wealth, producing things and being greedy, right? First of all, that is not a proper characterization of his view of capitalism, right? And also he had a more nuanced understanding of society beyond just economics, because he wrote multiple books. And The Wealth of Nations, even though that's the most common one, the most popular one that we know him for, it is not definitely the only one that defined his contributions.
So from these books, Dr. Brian, my observation is Adam Smith wasn't only an economist, but he was also a moral philosopher. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. Indeed, you are totally right. I think that's a great distinction that you pointed out. If you think about the world of economics today, maybe you study economics or your listeners, learn economics in university, you will realize that today it's a highly specialized discipline, right? Where you are mainly engaging in mathematical modeling, statistical exercises, right? And econometric regressions, for example. There is nothing wrong with this, but today, because it's so highly specialized, economists today do not take into account or pay attention to many other disciplines. For example, ethics, philosophy, history, political sciences. So we live in an age of hyper specialization in the academic realm. Okay, but this was not the case when Adam Smith was writing. Okay, this was definitely not the case. If you open up any of the books of Adam Smith, you will realize that he was knowledgeable on a range of topics, not just economics, right? So it was an interdisciplinary study of society and an inquiry into the wealth of nations. So when he talked about economics, it was also about human nature. It was also about the role of government in society. So it was very interdisciplinary, right? So and that's why his position at the time was that of a moral philosopher, right? And of course, he contributed his thoughts on the economy as we know it, right? So it was very interdisciplinary and very unlike what we have today. So this is one of the problems, that many of my colleagues and many classical liberals today, the criticisms they have about the discipline of economics today, not just only because there could be certain left-wing ideas or socialist ideas. That's true, that may be definitely a problem, but also the way economics has become too specialized and devoid of the kind of interdisciplinary inquiry that we see in the past, right? So Adam Smith, he's what we call a classical political economist, right? And classical political economy, is full of interdisciplinary insights, unlike what we have today.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Dr. Brian. I remember during my college days, I had my economics class, and unfortunately, my professor never mentioned Adam Smith at all. Probably he mentioned David Ricardo, but never Adam Smith. I only encountered Adam Smith by reading books in my spare time in the realm of philosophy and sociology, but not economics, because it's always tied to Karl Marx. They're always being juxtaposed. And so that's quite unfortunate later on when I realized, because we lack the necessary theoretical foundation and even philosophical foundation to make sense of economics as a field. Just like what you said earlier, it's all about numbers and graphs. And so it's difficult for my peers and for me as well to appreciate economics. No, what is the message behind the numbers? Is there an overarching story about these numbers? And without Adam Smith and his theoretical contributions, it's difficult for us to make sense of these numbers and figures. Now, for my next question, Dr. Brian, what are the contributions of Adam Smith to economics exactly? And can his ideas help us make sense of our problems today and address them, like inequality, employment, or even climate change?
Yes, certainly. I think these are great questions. So Adam Smith had many contributions that are very relevant to us today. I think the first key contribution he provided in his historical context was that mercantilism was a bad idea. So it's very hard for us to imagine today, but he lived in a world where mercantilism was the dominant economic system. And for simplicity's sake, mercantilism basically was the idea that a country should basically maximize its wealth by having as much gold and currency in its vaults, right? So they wanted to protect what we call the balance of trade. So if a country would be importing more goods from other nations, that means that hard currency will be flowing out. If you're spending more money on other people's goods, then you're going to lose out. So we need to protect our domestic industries and we need to keep as much wealth within the country as possible. So that was the whole idea of mercantilism, which Adam Smith was against, right? So instead of mercantilism, he focused on the nation's production and consumption. So wealth does not depend on the amount of money that you keep within the country, but wealth is generated through free exchange. When individuals, companies, and people in society produce wealth, produce goods and services, and exchange it with others. So it's about the amount of goods and services that are produced for the benefit of consumers. That is how wealth is generated, and that's how society becomes prosperous, right? And it boils down to the individual, right? If you trade with me and I exchange with you, two parties benefit, right? And so trade is the basis of wealth because we engage in value exchange, right? And a nation's productive capacity is also resting on the division of labor. When we specialize in what we are good at, you specialize maybe in producing podcasts, I specialize in maybe writing economics books, right? And someone else specializes in maybe being a driver or maybe an entrepreneur. This is how we become more productive, right? And there will be an increase in the capacity of a nation, right? There will be capital accumulation, greater investment, more wealth will be created in the process, right? And so these are some very basic insights that actually we all take for granted today when learning economics, right? But at the time when Adam Smith was writing, these ideas were quite alien. So this is one key idea, the importance of specialization, division of labor, and trade. The second very important idea was about the role of government. So Adam Smith famously argued that what we want in society is a government that protects economic freedom. And by economic freedom, we mean that the government is limited, okay, to the protection of private property, maintenance of the rule of law, right? And what Adam Smith called a tolerable administration of justice. That's all we need, according to Adam Smith, for a nation to rise from poverty to prosperity, which means that we do not need central planning. There is no need for a strong government to engage in central planning in order for a nation to become rich. Now, do not get me wrong. This does not mean that we have no government. This does not even mean that government is not important. Government is important. In fact, there is a role for government to maintain defense, justice, and the rule of law. So it is not true that people are saying, oh, Adam Smith was an anarchist. You know, if you believe in economic freedom, you hate government. That's not true. There is a role for government, right? Government is important to ensure a basic sense of rules, law, and order. But aside from this, Adam Smith was trying to focus on the spontaneous order of human action, which is how when people are left free to engage in exchange, when people are free to pursue their own happiness, right? What you see is not some kind of uncontrolled chaos, right? When you leave people to do what they want, you see chaos. No. In fact, there's a certain harmony in society, right? Where there is coordination, where there is social cooperation, where even though people are left free to pursue their own actions, you see on a macro level, on an overall level, there is a certain harmony, there is a certain sense of coordination and overall wealth that's generated. So this is what many economists call the spontaneous order of human action, right? That there are unintended consequences of human action that is beyond anyone's design, right? And there could be positive outcomes, right, through the individual actions on the ground. So, and that's the reason why, in society, we do not need extensive government controls and regulations. Ironically, we can keep government minimal and simple. And that's how we can become prosperous in society.
So I guess, Dr. Brian, given our current condition today, let's say we have widespread inequality, would Adam Smith be against the idea of redistributing wealth done by the government?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to say Adam Smith was quite a nuanced thinker. So he certainly did not oppose some forms of redistribution, some forms of public welfare, and some role for government in terms of social policy. So in a sense, Adam Smith was not dogmatically opposed to such social welfare. And also I have to first clarify before we talk about inequality, for the sake of all listeners and students here, that actually Adam Smith, he had quite a complex and nuanced understanding of human nature, right? Because some people think, oh, Adam Smith, when he talked about capitalism, it's just about people pursuing their self-interest. That is one part of the story. But remember, he also believed in writing this other book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that human beings have what we call a natural sympathy for others. Okay? This enables human beings to moderate their behavior and preserve harmony. Okay? And we have the capacity to feel for our fellow men when we see people who are suffering. Right? We have a sort of empathy or sympathy for others. And this allows us to form moral judgments, right, about society, to engage even sometimes in altruistic behavior, right? And without this sense of justice, and virtue in human beings, society will actually crumble, right? So it's not just purely an issue of dog eat dog in capitalism, right? So it is not just about capitalism creating wealth and the government having to step in to provide social welfare, even though that is part of the story, right? Human beings are able and they have the capacity to engage in altruism as well to help their fellow men, right? So Adam Smith had a complex view of human nature than what many of his critics give him credit for. And going back to the issue of inequality, which you described, first of all, we have to understand that inequality can be resulting from various factors. Okay? Inequality could result simply from, the natural differences of people. If you are different from me, there will definitely be some level of inequality. If we are free to pursue our own happiness, if let's say you have very different talents from me, you have very different backgrounds from me, you have very different dreams as compared to me. Let's say you want to become a doctor. For me, I have very different talents. I'm born to a very different background. I, let's say, want to become a teacher. If you are free to pursue your happiness, I'm free to pursue my happiness, we will end up in very different endpoints and outcomes. So in a sense, there is nothing wrong with inequality in that sense. And certainly Adam Smith was a firm believer in what he called the natural system of liberty, where if we allow people to pursue their own happiness, we will end up with very different outcomes. And there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, that is to be celebrated because we do not want, to force everyone to be the same. We want people to pursue their own happiness. And if you allow them to do so, we end up very different. We would not want to create some kind of forced equality, some forced homogeneity. So certainly Adam Smith would be very okay. In fact, I would think he would support what I would say now, which is that it's very much a reflection of natural differences. But having said that, Adam Smith was also very cognizant of the fact that in the economy, there will always be some special interests. It could be some corporations, some firms or business people who would want to gain special privileges within the economic process. So they want to use government power to distort the market system for their own benefit. For example, in today's context, right, we have employers, professionals, big corporations, they may promote regulations that stifle competition. They may want to advocate for entry barriers that prevent people from practicing in particular trades. These were things that happened during the time of Adam Smith, and we see that even today in a very extensive way. So that's why many times we think, oh, corporations, they want to be free from government regulations. Not always the case. Not always the case, because sometimes corporations find that they can benefit with more government regulations because they are protected from other competition, from the using the regulation. So that's why sometimes what we see is the collusion of economic elites with government. And when that happens, inequality is resulting from that. You have inequality because you have rich people who manage to be protected from competition using government, and then inequality results. So if inequality results from such means, what we call the political means, then this is very unjust. And certainly this is not a reflection of economic freedom and the productivity of the economy. And certainly Adam Smith will be very against that. So that's why when people talk about inequality, when I discuss inequality, I always try to distinguish between the various forms of inequality. So we need to ask ourselves, is the inequality resulting from natural market competition, or does it result from unfair distortion of the market through the political process, which we should rightfully condemn? And Adam Smith would also condemn that today.
But what about in the issue of climate change, Dr. Brian? Can Adam Smith help us on it?
So that's a very good question. So it's not just about climate change, but I would say also about environmental problems today. So certainly you are right to mention this and raise this issue up, because today there are many critics of the market system, really, who point to how there is widespread environmental degradation. And capitalism usually is being blamed for that, because the whole idea is corporations or even basically individuals, they pursue the self-interest. And when you pursue the self-interest, you may have no regard for, the environmental impact that you may have on society. And economists today have this term called externalities, where you impose third-party cost on others and you do not internalize those actions. So if you think about, let's say, a corporation, let's say a factory down the street, they are engaging in industrial activity, you have carbon emissions that are released, causing air pollution and climate change. You could have hunters and poachers, right, engaging in the endangerment of some animal species. And there is also this whole idea of how in this market-driven society today, resources are being depleted. So we could have endless consumerism, and one fine day, some of the natural resources that we are very dependent on today could become depleted, especially with overpopulation and the consumption that brings. So definitely we live in a world, in an age where concerns of the environment are leveled against the operation of the free market. So I would say that the ideas of Adam Smith are definitely very relevant, even though Adam Smith did not explicitly discuss environmental issues, because that really wasn't his main concern, and it wasn't really part of the historical context that that he was really discussing. But there are in fact many ideas that market-oriented economists in the tradition of Adam Smith have written extensively about. So yes, environmental problems do not always necessarily require top-down government intervention and control. There are some cases in which command and control policies may be necessary, especially when social problems may be extremely urgent and severe, and when there's a clear-cut solution. However, many times what we may want is to harness the incentives of the market in order to solve some of these problems. So, for example, there is a very big school of thought today called free market environmentalism, where economists are thinking about how we can use market solutions to solve environmental problems. For example, sometimes when you have the depletion of resources, or let's say the degradation of natural areas, it is due to the lack and absence of property rights. When let's say you have fishes, or let's say a certain pool of animals or resources which are held in the open, and they are not privatized, they are not owned by a private company, that's where there could be no incentive for conservation of resources. But if resources are owned by a private company or owned by a private organization, there will be greater incentives for conservation to take place. So property rights over resources actually leads to conservation. That's one mechanism where markets actually help the environment. The second mechanism there is how markets promote innovation. So markets occur through competition, and competition breeds innovation. And when there's innovation, we discover better ways of producing goods and services with lesser resources. So green technology, sustainable development techniques today are very common. They would not be possible without the massive investments that companies put in, right? So today we have things like solar power, we have electric vehicles, which we say are, the future in sustainability. This would not be possible without innovation, without the massive investments that companies engage in, which also brings me to a bigger point about economic growth. So many times, critics of the market system would say, this endless consumerism in the free market. Well, what do we mean by endless consumerism? People need to, engage in trade. People need to work, people need to eat, and there's nothing wrong with economic growth. Economic growth is something that people rely on for their livelihoods. And I think it is extremely inhumane, actually, for people in developed countries who have economic growth and who have enjoyed it for decades and centuries to tell people in developing countries and poor countries that you need to sacrifice economic growth in order to protect the environment. But people in poor countries and developing countries, they need economic growth. And that is the priority at that point in time in their stage of development. And for economic growth to take place, many times they need to have access to cheap and abundant sources of energy. And that means fossil fuels, right? And that means having fossil fuels at this stage of development, because renewable energy such as solar power at this point in time is not yet cost effective for it to be used in a widespread fashion. Developing countries need access to fossil fuels. But today in the discourse, in the media and the debate today, we talk about how we need to sacrifice the use of fossil fuels. But that's inhumane, because you are sacrificing the economic growth of people in these countries. And I think that's inhumane. That's extremely inhumane. And also, at the end of the day, economic growth is also not divorced from environmental concerns, because growth must always come first. And when you have growth, people will then find ways to then be able to manage environmental concerns as well. So growth is not an enemy of the environment. Growth is actually a friend of the natural environment, right? As a matter of fact, if you think about it, it is in richer countries and developed countries that we have environmental movements with environmental technologies and environmental progress. Richer countries also have cleaner environments. Market-driven societies are the ones with cleaner environments.
Right, right. So you mentioned some popular caricatures of Adam Smith earlier. Detractors accuse him of promoting greed and anarchism. What are the other misconceptions about Adam Smith?
Yeah, so there are indeed numerous, misconceptions of the contributions of Adam Smith that you rightly pointed out. And the first issue is this whole idea of self-interest. Critics of the market or critics of Adam Smith think he's being simplistic when he talks about how when people pursue the self-interest, right, there will always be good outcomes that result from the pursuit of self-interest. Now, that is not so simple. So it's not just about the pursuit of self-interest, it's the pursuit of self-interest under certain institutional conditions. Because Adam Smith would readily agree that sometimes self-interest would not lead to good outcomes. For example, a few minutes ago, we talked about environmental issues, right? So let's say if we have what we call the tragedy of the commons, if we have natural resources which are not privately owned, under private ownership. In such scenarios, when people pursue the self-interest, there would be negative outcomes, right? There will be suboptimal outcomes because all these resources would naturally be depleted. Because if I do not go in to strip the resource, someone else is going to do it. So everyone has the incentive to go in and strip the resource, and the outcome is disaster for the environment. So Adam Smith was saying that we need to have proper institutional rules such that you can harness the incentives of people. So it is self-interest under the institution of the rule of law, under the institution of property rights and limited government. It is only within certain conditions that the pursuit of self-interest would be optimal. So when we advocate for free market capitalism as classical liberals, it's also very important for us to emphasize that there are some conditions that make that possible as well. That means clear and defined property rights. And what are property rights? It sounds very complex, but property rights simply mean that we want the government to protect you and your property. The law protects you when you are being expropriated, when you are being, unfairly, attacked, let's say in public. It is property rights based. And also there is the rule of law, which means that no one is above the law, that we follow the law and not the whims and fancies of certain politicians. And also we have a system that is rule-based, that follows contracts. And these are the basic conditions of markets that Adam Smith was talking about. And another misconception that people are talking about is the whole idea that the government has no role to play. That's not the case, because government has a very important role to play. right? For example, let's say if there's unfair competition in the market, right? If there's some monopolies who dominate the economy such that there is no longer any choice for consumers, no longer any more competition. So it's not just the pursuit of greed and self-interest in every circumstance. No, there are some circumstances where the government may need to set a level playing field to ensure that every company, every individual plays by the rules and there is a level playing field throughout. There could be some room for government intervention in those cases, right? And Adam Smith would naturally and rightly so agree with the role of a government in that case as well. I would say these are the major conceptions, and also the very important idea of moral sentiments, which Adam Smith really was a strong believer in, because he wrote an entire book on this. So the whole idea of natural sympathies and sentiments, I think, is a very important idea. And if you just allow me to read some quotes from Adam Smith that I prepared for you, I think your listeners will find this very interesting. So in the book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, I quote Adam Smith here. He wrote this: "However selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature, okay, in human nature, which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, even though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." So this is Adam Smith. You will not think that he will write something like this, right? This is exactly what he wrote. So he pointed out the capacity of human beings to have empathy for our fellow man. So this is a very common misconception that people read Adam Smith and they do not see this entire side of him.
This is a wonderful quote, Dr. Brian. Well, for the benefit of everyone who's tuning in right now, Dr. Brian, where can we find more helpful resources on Adam Smith?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are many helpful resources that your listeners can check out. Number one, I think, my website, adamsmith.com.sg may be a resource. I've also released a series of educational videos that your listeners may be interested in. It's on the platform Future Learn, where we have several courses on environmental economics, where we try to apply the ideas of Adam Smith to understand environmental problems today. And if I may just point to one specific one, which I think is very important, and that's called resource depletion, right? And the importance of innovation. And in this particular course, we point to this figure called Julian Simon, who was also influenced by Adam Smith, and he talked about the importance of the human mind. And when we allow people to be free to pursue wealth and to innovate in the economy, there will be innovations that result in the market. And these innovations mean that we'll never actually run out of resources, because we find new ways of using existing resources and discovering new resources as we go along. So I think these are some very helpful resources. And of course, there's some very great books that your listeners can feel free to check out. They might want to check out Eamon Butler's primer on Adam Smith. Eamon Butler from the Adam Smith Institute in the UK. Your listeners might also want to check out this book called Mainline Economics by Peter Bettke from George Mason University. They might also want to read economic historian Deidre McCloskey, who has written a trilogy called the Bourgeois Trilogy, applying the ideas of Adam Smith to economic history and how the wealth that we see in the world today is a result of people being left free. Entrepreneurs given the liberty and dignity. That's how the world that we live in today, all this wealth that we see, which we take for granted today, was possible only because of the liberty and dignity that people received in history.
If you enjoyed this episode, use the hashtag ECONvo and visit the Foundation for Economic Freedom's Facebook page for more updates. Kita-kits next time!